Just before we get started today, we wanted to mention we just launched a new channel called Higher Learning, in which we fly around in a little airplane and talk about interesting aviation-related topics, from interesting history to aviation-related questions you might wonder about, all set to absolutely gorgeous scenery from the air. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, go check out Higher Learning, link below. In any event, in the pantheon of origin stories for some of the world's biggest businesses, there are no shortage of fascinating tales. From that time, Colonel Sanders of KFC fame quite literally tried to kill his competition via a gunfight that saw one dead and his competition jailed for it, even though said competition was outnumbered 3-1 in the gunfight and just defending himself. And he got shot by the colonel, while Colonel Sanders himself got off scot-free for the whole thing, despite being the instigator. From there to Steve Jobs selling illegal devices that allowed people to make collect phone calls for free, which all indirectly led to the creation of Apple. To the founder of FedEx early in the company's existing, having to take the last few $1,000s the company had and go gamble it in Vegas in hopes of winning enough to keep from going bankrupt. He was successful, obviously. All stories we'd covered before on our sister channel, Today I Found Out, links below. Today, however, we're going to be looking at shoes, and specifically the rather humble origins of the company that would eventually split into Adidas and Puma, started by two Nazi brothers who, thanks to World War II, throwing each other under the bus for their Nazi activities, and one of their wives rubbing the one brother the wrong way, a family feud ensued, seeing the company split and the two becoming bitter rivals. Soon after, the townspeople got sucked into it all as well, with anyone siding with one or the other having nothing to do with anyone on the other side. So much so that the town became nicknamed the Town of Bent Neck, owing to everyone checking each other's shoes to see if they should associate with them. So here now is the fascinating story of the founding of two of the three biggest sporting shoe companies in the world, and just for fun, we'll be throwing in the origin of the top dog, Nike, and the bonus facts in a bit. Which, by the way, the feud between the aforementioned brothers likely played a large role in gift wrapping that top spot to Nike in the ensuing decades. But to begin with, our story today starts in the relatively small town of
Herzogenaurach.
Germany, with two brothers, Adolf Dassler, nicknamed Addy, and his older brother Rudolf, who apparently wasn't special enough to get a nickname. Leading up to their shoe adventures, Rudolf fought in World War I, while Addy was left home, owing to being too young at the time to be conscripted. As for filling his hours, after schooling complete, Addy tried his hand as an apprentice baker, but ultimately decided against being surrounded by smells of delicious fresh-baked bread every day. Both brothers variously also worked for their mother, helping with their laundry business, with the brothers primarily in charge of deliveries, while their mother and sister, Marie, washed the clothes. Unfortunately for the family, after the war, the laundry business wasn't doing so well, and additional income was needed to keep the family solvent. Enter Addy, who had in his spare time began learning his father's trade as a cobbler. An avid fan of various sports, as Addy learned more and more about not making tasty bread or type of dessert, but shoes, he had some ideas on how to make custom footwear for various sports and improve on the existing designs of the day. And so it was that he got the bright idea to not just go work for the town's existing shoe company, like his father, but start his own. Unfortunately for him, he had no money, and post-World War I Germany wasn't exactly flush with resources anyway. But Addy was a problem solver. To get around the trivial roadblock of no money or supplies to make his product, he simply began scavenging around for needed materials from old war equipment that was quite literally just lying around in fields. Anything he found, he could find some way to use to make shoes he collected. This included everything from leather belts to helmets to old parachutes, which on the latter he took to making slippers, which apparently sold well. As for Rudolf, after the war, he was initially interested in becoming a police officer and even completed training for such. More importantly, for his future work, he also tried his hand as a salesman at a porcelain factory, as well as at leather trading, and even worked at a shoemaking factory for a time alongside his father. But in 1923, as Addy's business began to look like it might really become a thing, he decided to join his little brother, and about a year later, the two registered the Dassler Brothers Sports Shoe Factory, initially operating out of the space their mom ran her laundry business out of. It's also interesting to note here that the town at the time wasn't exactly flush with reliable electricity, which the brothers needed in their shoe manufacturing. To get around the problem, they simply set up a bike modified to drive their equipment, such as attached to a leather milling machine. Between Addy's ingenuity and Rudolph's skill as a salesman and marketer, the pair initially made an extremely complementary team and got along swimmingly. Their shoes, which Addy was constantly tinkering with, also began separating their product from their competition. This ultimately caught the eye of the coach of the German Olympic track team, Josef Walzer, who took a trip from Munich to
Herzogenaurach.
check out their new product. Long story short here, as the shoes at this point were ahead of any other track shoe at the time in a number of ways, he both helped direct athletes to buy the shoe and began consulting with the brothers on modifications he'd like to see both from his own experience and from feedback from athletes themselves. This all saw their shoe being relatively popularly used by some German athletes during the 1928 Olympic Games in Amsterdam, such as Lena Radke, who won gold in the 800 meter wearing them. The shoes were even more popular among German athletes during the 1932 Games. Things really went to the next level, however, thanks to the Nazis. As for the brothers' politics, this isn't totally clear today, with there potentially being a bit of whitewashing of history with one and perhaps both of them. As for Rudolf, he joined the Nazi Party in 1933, though it isn't clear if this was just for business reasons, as the timing was around when they began supplying the Hitler Youth with shoes. Sidling up with this organization was originally seemingly at Adi's insistence because of the massive potential for growth of the company if they could work their way in there. And just in general, if you wanted to go far business-wise in Germany in the 1930s and early 1940s, being a member of the Nazi Party was very advantageous towards these ends. That said, there does seem to be anecdotal evidence that Rudolf agreed with at least some of the Nazi ideologies, though again, separating fact from fiction on all of this is difficult for reasons we'll get into shortly when we start talking more about the brothers' pretty extreme feud. As for Adi, while he may have shared the first name of the infamous Führer, he does not seem to have been quite so keen on the party, though he did join up at the same time as Rudolf. But evidence seems to be that he, for example, had no problem with Jewish people or other races and otherwise was happy to do business with anyone before and after the war. On top of that, he seems to have hidden one Jewish man on his property in the latter part of the war, as we'll get into in a bit. And as noted, the whole Hitler Youth Movement supplier and coach thing for them, as he was, seems to have been more for business reasons rather than ideological ones, although still not exactly a gold star move, obviously. On that note, naturally after the war, Adi was quick to point out he never took part in anything more directly political than coaching sports for the Hitler Youth, and further pointed out that at the time he was also a member of the Liberal Gymnast Club and various other sporting organizations that didn't align with Nazi views at all. He was simply trying to associate with any organization that might want to purchase some of his shoes. As author Barbara Smith, author of Sneaker Wars, notes, the stranglehold that the Nazis established on all aspects of German life forced both brothers to become more deeply involved with the movement. They signed off letters with the obligatory Heil Hitler, they held the same swastika stamped membership card of the National Socialist Driver Corps. The two brothers, however, didn't embrace the cause with equal warmth. While Rudolf vocally expressed his approval of the government's policies, Adi usually stuck to his ordinary hardworking decency. When it came to his relationship with Jews, Adi's records also confirmed that he continued to deal with Jewish leather traders long after this became politically incorrect. Speaking of the Nazis and the brothers' ever-accelerating rise to the top of sporting shoe wear, it was the 1936 Olympics in Berlin that really showcased their product, and not just because most of the German athletes wore them, but most of all because of a rather legendary American athlete that did the same. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he was actually against hosting the Olympic Games. Promoting internationalism and multicultural celebration wasn't exactly his cup of tea. He also felt the games were, to quote him, an invention of the Jews and Freemasons, and some thought he'd cancel them being hosted in Berlin, and of course there was much controversy surrounding even holding them there in the first place, given the Nazi Party's viewpoints didn't exactly hold with Olympic ideals. However, Hitler was convinced by Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, that the games would actually give the Nazis a great platform to demonstrate Germany's supposed superiority, as well as that of their athletes, not just to the world, but to Germany's own people. As Goebbels said in the interview in 1933, German sport has only one task: to strengthen the character of the German people, imbuing it with the fighting spirit and steadfast camaraderie necessary in the struggle for its existence. And so it was that 6 months after taking power, Hitler announced that he had decided to allow the games to be hosted in Berlin after all. As alluded to at this point, many of the German athletes at the Games were wearing shoes made by the brothers. Importantly, for their later expansion and survival of their factory at all after the upcoming war, One other individual also chose to wear them thanks to Addy literally just walking up to him and getting him to try his shoes out. That athlete was the legend that was Jesse Owens. In the games, Owen would go on to wow the world and throw a bit of a fly in the ointment of supposed Aryan superiority via winning 4 gold medals. And by the way, just a fun fact, a year earlier he had set 3 world records in a meet in Michigan. What makes this so special is that he set those 3 world records in the span of just 1 hour, something no other track star has managed since in such a time span. As another brief Jesse Owens aside here, there's a story that Hitler snubbed Owens by leaving the Olympic Stadium when Hitler was supposed to congratulate medal winners, including Owens. However, Owens denied the claim that Hitler disrespected him, stating, "Hitler had a certain time to come to the stadium and a certain time to leave. It happened he had to leave before the victory ceremony after the 100 meters, but before he left I was on my way to a broadcast and passed near his box. He waved to me and I waved back." Noteworthy, other witnesses of the wave claimed Hitler didn't just wave, but gave Owens the Olympic salute, which kind of looks similar. Hitler also later sent Owens an inscribed photograph of himself to commemorate Owens' achievement. Owens further went on to say, "Hitler didn't snub me, it was FDR who snubbed me. The president didn't even send me a telegram. When I came back to my native country, after all the stories about Hitler, I couldn't ride in the front of the bus. I had to go to the back door. I couldn't live where I wanted. I wasn't invited to shake hands with Hitler, but I wasn't invited to the White House to shake hands with the president either." To make matters worse, when Owens arrived at his own reception party at the Waldorf Hotel back in New York after a parade, he was not allowed to enter the hotel via the main doors and was also not allowed to use the normal elevators once inside. Instead, he had to use an alternate entrance and a freight elevator to get to a party being held in his honor at the hotel. On top of that, despite being literally one of the most famous athletes in the world at this point, he also found it difficult to find any work or sponsorship after, and ultimately had to take odd jobs like working as a gas station attendant to make ends meet. The past, say it with me, was the worst. Speaking of the worst, if you're now wondering Hitler's thoughts on Owens' victories, German architect and Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, stated, "Each of the German victories, and there were a surprising number of these, made Hitler happy. But he was highly annoyed by the series of triumphs by the marvelous colored American runner Jesse Owens. People whose antecedents came from the jungle were primitive," Hitler said with a shrug. "Their physiques were stronger than those of civilized whites, and hence should be excluded from the future games." The classic Nazi tactic of if you can't beat them, get rid of them, and then pretend you're better. But in any event, one of Hitler's more public 1936 speeches during those Olympics was to say, "The sportive knightly battle awakens the best human characteristics. It doesn't separate, but unites the combatants in understanding and respect. It also helps to connect the countries in the spirit of peace. That's why the Olympic flame should never die." And now we will point out that Hitler was already planning what would become World War II when he said those words. Going back to Addy and Rudolph's little shoe business, the seeds of their future feud were also already being sown around this time, when a few years before, in 1932, the 32-year-old Addy met the 15-year-old daughter of one Franz Martz, who was a teacher at the Footwear Technical College, which apparently was a thing, and an institution Addy had enrolled in. The young teen girl in question was Kathy Martz, and Addy apparently hit it off with her immediately. As Franz rather liked the, again, 32-year-old Addy, he allowed him to court his 15-year-old daughter, and after 2 years of courtship, the pair got married. This was, however, much to the chagrin of apparently pretty much everyone in the Dassler family, who largely hated the teen girl. You see, Kathy allegedly had little in the way of a filter between her brain and her mouth, and otherwise was not shy in the slightest about giving her opinion on pretty much everything, including how the business should be run. This was something Addy seems to have not minded in the slightest, and indeed even encouraged. Rudolph and most of the rest of the family, however, took major issue with this, with Rudolph stating she constantly, to quote him, tried to interfere in business matters. He also later stated when discussing the eventual family feud that prior to the happy couple becoming a thing, Addy and he had had an ideal relationship in and outside of work. After, not so much on all fronts. And for whatever it's worth, Rudolph claimed in a letter he would later write to one of his Puma distributors that the rift between the pair was all down to Kathy, and things sort of spiraled from there. And as we'll get into shortly when we say spiral, by the end it got extremely nasty to the point of even trying to have each other in prison so that the other could take over the company. In any event, going back to the 1936 Olympic Games, when the dust had settled, athletes wearing the brothers' shoes at those games won 7 golds, 5 silvers, and 5 bronze medals, quickly boosting sales up to over 200,000 pairs of of shoes per year, as coaches all around the world began looking to equip their athletes with the brothers' innovative shoes. As with many businesses in Germany, however, they were about to hit a rough patch. When World War II began, the brothers' factory was initially enlisted to help via making boots, leather army satchels, and other similar war supplies, while also allowed to continue making their sporting shoes. However, on this one, as you might expect, demand plummeted, and finding a workforce to make even what they were able to sell became a bit of an issue. Things got even worse as the war progressed when, in 1943, the need for weapons became greater than the need for shoes, and their factory was subsequently converted to one geared towards helping making anti-tank weapons similar to a bazooka called a Panzerschreck. Also during the war, Adi was initially conscripted in August of 1940 and began training as a radio technician, but by February of the following year, allegedly in part thanks to Rudolph, at least according to Rudolph, Adi was allowed to leave the service owing to his skills being deemed better used by running the brothers' company. As for Rudolph, as he'd served in World War I, he was initially exempt from serving in World War II. This is where things started to get really dicey. To begin with, the pair's sister Marie begged to have two of her sons employed at the factory, but Rudolph stepped in and refused, stating, "There are enough family problems at the company." As to what exactly the problems were, this isn't totally clear, but the result of his decision was significant because had they been employed there, they would have been exempt, at least at this point, from going to fight in the war. Instead, they were conscripted and, unfortunately for her and them, both her sons were soon after killed. You can probably guess from this which side of the family feud she would go with later on. Relations became ever more strained during the war as they were all ultimately forced to house together in rather cramped quarters, with once again Rudolph blaming Kathy for much of the strain between all of them. That said, it's at this point we should explicitly note here that Rudolph had a bit of a reputation for being extremely difficult to deal with himself, allegedly having a rather abrasive and controlling personality, which goes a long way in explaining why a woman like Kathy and a man like Rudolph might rub each other the wrong way. Whatever the case there, making it all worse, Rudolph soon began actively attempting to wrest control of the company from Adi, which by the way would have better protected Rudolph from what happened next when, as the need for more able-bodied men swelled, in January of 1943, Rudolph ended up being drafted despite his previous service in World War I. Adi, on the other hand, was once again exempt owing to being considered the leader of the company. Rudolph would later bitterly blame, to quote him, "my brother and his Nazi party friends," for his conscription, even though it seems like really Rudolph was the one who had a lot more Nazi friends. Whatever the case there, he also wrote Adi stating something that probably sounds even more angry in German: "I will not hesitate to seek the closure of the factory so that you be forced to take up an occupation that will allow you to play the leader and as a first-class sportsman to carry a gun." And indeed, he would soon after denounce Adi to various Nazi party leaders in the region to attempt to get Adi in trouble and make a job opening for himself to head up the factory. At the same time, he also used his contacts within the party, which he had a lot of, to try to convince them either way to put him in charge of the factory and switch back to making improved boots for the army that he'd personally designed, and thus also allow him to leave the military in the process. This all came to nothing, however, and instead, when the Soviets took over Tushin and decimated the unit Rudolph was assigned to, he took that as his cue to abscond from service and did so. However, whether he deserted or what exactly happened here is a matter of debate to this day. After all this, he was either placed in Barenschan's prison for desertion by the Gestapo, or was rather simply summoned because he was already directly working for them. Either way, his overt efforts in the war were over. Whatever the case, once the Nazis were trounced, things got even worse for the brothers and the company. In the first place, when Allied troops took over the town, their first thought upon seeing the factory, which had been used to make weapons, was to destroy it. Driving their tanks up to do just that, the young spitfire of a woman, Kathy, who we're liking more and more as we read more about her temperament, unabashedly waltz up to the troops and tanks quite literally about to blow up her factory and stop them in their tracks. How'd she do this, you ask? She told them that, left to their own devices, they were nothing but a simple shoemaking factory, and that it was in fact their shoes that Jesse Owens himself had so famously worn in the 1936 Olympic Games. This all intrigued the soldiers, who changed their mind about destroying the factory and instead became very interested in acquiring some of these state-of-the-art running shoes for themselves. Not long after, when supplies for making the shoes were non-existent, some of the leaders among the Allies in the area even helped Adi and company acquire needed materials to get their factory running properly again, primarily using unneeded war supplies. However, while Kathy had saved the factory with her sheer gumption, her husband and his brother were not out of the woods initially. being both members of the Nazi Party and, again, having had their factory used in the war effort to make weapons. And this is where the brothers' split seems to have become irreconcilable. You see, over the course of the investigation about their activities during the war, both brothers turned on each other. Rudolf accused Adi of being a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi who he accused of previously making political speeches left and right in support of Nazi ideals. He also pointed out that Adi, not him, had allowed the factory to be converted to making weapons, something Rudolf claims he'd never have let happen if he'd been in charge at the time and not forced to go fight in the war against his wishes. As for Adi, he and Kathy likewise in turn accused Rudolf of being a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi and working for the Gestapo, something the investigators already strongly suspected from the available evidence was true. However, trying to sort through the mess, initially Adi was deemed a Bellastater, which would have seen him subject to up to a decade in the clink if that had stuck. However, Adi's friends and acquaintances came through for him. Most critically was the half-Jewish mayor of a neighboring town, Weisendorf, Hans Wormser, who claimed that the Gestapo were coming to arrest him when Adi came and not only warned him, but also hid him from them for a time after. Said Wormser in Adi's defense, a true supporter of Adolf Hitler would certainly not have done this, putting his existence and his well-being of his family on the line. Beyond this, many others came forward to attest that despite having been a member of the Nazi Party and his factory eventually used for making weapons, Adi had never been political. Adi would also point out that even the accusations of war profiteering didn't really add up, as over the course of the war, his previously quite successful and rapidly growing little company had actually lost a huge sum of money and was brought to the brink of ruin. Thanks to all this, Adi was downgraded to the classification of Minder Bellastetter, which more or less put him on probation for a couple years and initially not allowed to run his company. That said, this didn't last long and he was ultimately allowed to run things under supervision until February of 1947, at which point he was able to resume managing the company without oversight. In the end, Adi got off pretty clean. Rudolf, however, didn't have people come out of the woodworks in support of him like Adi did, and authorities, whether right or wrong, were pretty convinced he was hiding a lot about his activities during the war. And thus he spent about a year incarcerated while things were sorted out, but in the end the sheer number of people being held resulted in them eventually just having to let most go without figuring out the truth of their specific situations, which is what happened to Rudolf. Thus both brothers were more or less absolved of their former Nazi affiliation and allowed to go on their way after. But as they'd literally just attempted to get each other arrested and convicted for rather serious crimes, well, let's just say they were no longer on speaking terms, with some of the family, such as their mother, Paulina, siding with Rudolf, and some of the family, such as their sister Marie, siding with Adi. In the split, Adi got to keep the original factory and family home, while factory equipment was divided between the pair. Beyond this, the employees were likewise allowed to pick who they wanted to side with Rudolf and those following him, which was about a third of the staff, comprising mostly salespeople and administration, setting up shop on the other side of the river in the town. As for those who stuck with Adi, these were most of the designers and production staff. At this point, Kathy and Marie also came on board directly to take over some of the work of the departing sales and administration staff. After this brotherly divorce was complete, Adi and Rudolf reportedly never spoke to each other again. Soon after this, Adi officially rebranded his product as Adidas, more or less just contracting his moniker Adi with his last name Dassler. As for Rudolf, he officially registered his product as Ruda, but 10 months after coming up with that brand name, changed it to Puma, the Quechua word for cougar, wanting to associate his product with speed, agility, and endurance. Going back to Adi, to further distinguish his shoes from his brothers and other brands, he decided to begin coloring the side straps, reinforcing the shoes white, with his sister Marie and wife Kathy deciding on 3 stripes as the ideal number to be colored. The result was the basis of one of the most famous trademarks in business history in the process. From here, it was on. Both brothers saw quick success with their respective shoes. Although more the brains behind the actual shoe innovations, Adidas soon led the race. Adidas further saw a huge boost during the 1954 World Cup thanks to their extremely lightweight shoes, reportedly about half the weight of many competitors at the time, that also had an innovative design of spikes which could be swapped out depending on exact weather conditions. This was extremely important when the day of the World Cup final saw rather soggy conditions. In this match, the West German national team stunned the world by defeating the 5-year unbeaten and reigning Olympic champion Hungarian team 3-2. In the process, this helped highlight Adidas' rather innovative shoes on an international level and in a quite dramatic fashion. On the other side, Puma was flourishing as well thanks to various athletes wearing their shoes, eventually even the legendary footballer Pelé, who they apparently even contracted at one point to stop and retie his shoes on camera just to get the extra exposure. As the two companies flourished and became two of the biggest employers in the small town, soon residents were caught up in the rivalry, with businesses in the town reportedly checking shoes before deciding whether to serve someone or not, and likewise customers being loyal to only businesses that supported their respective shoe company. Beyond that, reportedly even intermarriage between supporters of the two sides was heavily frowned upon for a few decades there within the town. As for the brothers, as alluded to their death, they never reconciled or ever spoke again. In fact, they were even buried at opposite ends of the town's cemetery. That said, one of the descendants, Frank Dassler, grandson of Rudolph, controversially within his family broke the trend, beginning work for a time for Puma before ultimately switching sides to Adidas, where he worked up through 2018. As for his thoughts on the feud, he naturally thought it was kind of silly at this point, and further noted of his grandfather and Addy, they stayed kind of enemies during the rest of their lives. It's certainly sad, but from a business point of view, it was a good decision, since it motivated both companies to innovate. On that note, while their respective histories saw many ups and downs, today Adidas sits as the second largest sporting shoe manufacturer in the world, while Puma sits comfortably as number 3. But while they were dividing efforts and duking it out in Europe, they largely ignored the American market, with Rudolph even going so far as to chastise his son when he attempted to focus on it and the competition there instead. Which all brings us to our bonus fact for the day, Nike. As for their origins, they were much less Nazi-centric. Enter American businessman Phil Knight, who was convinced that the way to compete with the German product was to introduce cheap but high-quality running shoes from Japan. But though he had a great idea and a solid plan, Phil didn't have the money to achieve his goal. This native Oregonian, who today has a net worth of around $43 billion, back then was nothing more than a young man with a freshly minted MBA from Stanford University. As a former middle-distance runner in college, he was dreaming of a way to combine sports and business and make a living at it. During a world tour in 1963, Knight landed in Japan, where he managed to make an appointment with Onitsuka, the parent company of Tiger running shoes. Tiger Shoes was interested in selling sneakers to American runners and gave Knight samples, which he sent to the man he trusted most, his former coach at the University of Oregon, Bill Bowerman. When manufacturers didn't listen to his advice, he went to his garage and altered existing models of shoes to create the lightest and most comfortable shoes for his runners. Bowerman was impressed by the Tiger shoes Knight sent him and proposed that they work together to market them in the US. After finalizing a deal with Onitsuka, they shook on the details of a partnership on January 25th, 1964, creating Blue Ribbon Sports with an investment of $500 each, which is about $4,600 each today. However, by 1970, the working relationship between Blue Ribbon Sports and Onitsuka was collapsing, primarily as Knight thought that the financial arrangement with the Japanese firm was strangling his chances for expansion. So the association was dissolved and, in 1971, Blue Ribbon Sports launched its own line of footwear. They named the line Nike, the name of the Greek goddess of victory, although said goddess's pronunciation is more like Nike. As for their now iconic logo, they used a design created by Carolyn Davidson. At the time she created the now famous logo, Davidson was a student at Portland State University, where Knight was teaching as an assistant professor in accounting. It was simply by chance that Davidson met Knight at all. She was in the middle of a conversation with a fellow student in the graphics design department explaining that she didn't have enough money to take an oil painting class. Knight overheard and later approached her and asked her if she'd be interested in doing some graphics works for his business, offering her $2 an hour for the gig, about $14 per hour today. Davidson accepted and began doing various freelance jobs for Blue Ribbon Sports, mostly making charts and things of this nature. A few years later, when as noted, Knight was deciding it was time to move the business away from being just a US distributor of a Japanese running shoe, Knight decided his new company needed a distinctive logo. Thus, in 1971, Knight asked Davidson to design a stripe, which was the slang term at the time for a logo for a shoe. He further instructed her that he wanted it to give the impression of motion. Knight was particularly fond of the Adidas logo, and though he said it couldn't look too similar to that, he was apparently enamored by it. As Davidson said, "Oh, he loved Adidas. That was part of my problem. He loved the Adidas stripes. He loved them." Well, when you really love something, try to get somebody to look over here at something different. Davidson doodled for nearly 3 weeks off and on for the project. Her process was to draw, to quote her, a picture of a shoe, and then I drew logos on tissue. I'd lay it over, and then I'd crumple it up, because it had to look good on a shoe. Finally, with the deadline looming, Davidson presented several designs to Knight, Jeff Johnson, who incidentally was the one to suggest the name Nike for the brand, and Bob Waddell to look over. Knight's response was underwhelming. The first design he looked at was the swoosh. He then passed it up and looked at the rest, then came back to the swoosh and said the words every designer longs to hear: "I don't love it, but I think it will grow on me." Somewhat disappointed by his reaction, Davidson asked for time to perfect the design, but Knight said no. She then submitted her invoice of $35, which is about $320 today. One might think in retrospect she might be kicking herself for not asking for more, considering the logo she created went on to become one of the most well-known in the world. However, Davidson didn't see it that way, as she was happy with the wages at the time and had agreed to make the logo for that amount. So fair is fair. The fact that it became world famous was simply a nice feather in her cap. However, this is not the end of that tale. For starters, after leaving Nike in 1975, she had been given a job there after graduating from college in 1971. She went on to freelance, where being the designer of the Nike logo certainly helped her acquire clients over the years, and at a premium price. A more direct benefit happened in 1983, a few years after the company went public. Knight decided to honor Davidson for having created the company's logo and for her early work with Nike, so invited her to lunch, which actually turned out to be a surprise party in her honor. At the party, he gave her a gold ring that had a swoosh on the top with a diamond in it, but this wasn't the big payoff. He also gave her, according to Davidson, 500 shares of the company. So how much were 500 shares of Nike worth at the time? Around $8,000, or about $23,000 in today's dollars. Quite a sum, given Knight was not obligated to give her anything, nor was there any pressure to do so. But this wasn't the end of it. Davidson wisely held on to these 500 shares of Nike stock. Since that time, there have been several instances where the stock has been split, with today those shares worth about $3.5 million, though it isn't clear if the now retired Davidson has sold them since her last interview about it a little over a decade ago. Whatever the case, not too bad for producing something in a few weeks of part-time work. Going back to Nike's rise, the new Nike line of footwear made its debut in 1972 at the U.S. Track and Field Trials in Eugene, Oregon, and things pretty rapidly took off from there. Their product particularly saw a huge surge in the 1980s thanks to the Air Jordan line and sponsoring the basketball legend, which helped propel the company to top dog in the world of sporting shoes. Today, Nike Inc. not only dominates the global sports footwear market, but all shoe companies, with a market capitalization of $169.7 billion compared to Adidas' $20.9 billion and Puma $7.64 billion. And as noted, Knight's personal net worth alone is almost double the total combined valuation of Puma and Adidas, despite their otherwise enormous size for shoe companies.